Good morning, everybody. Pastor Tony and the group asked me to preach on a question evidently they've been getting. Maybe you've wrestled with a question too. How are we supposed to feel as Christians about these people that are doing these things in the world today, like Orlando? And people who grab a truck and drive into a crowd of people in France, or Dallas, or San Bernardino, or Turkey, or Paris, or Brussels, and all these places. And Jesus says this little small verse, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Three little words. Love your enemies. I was pastoring at La Sierra when 9/11 happened. And someone called me and said, "Pastor Dan, many churches are having a prayer vigil. We should have a candlelight vigil tonight." So, okay, never done it before. So we sent out an email to all the church, and it came down to the church. 100 people probably showed up. There was no time to prepare, no time to get a message, no time to plan anything. Just bring candles and walk in. So I stood up and I mumbled a few things about, can we forgive these people who did this terrible thing? And should we try to understand why do people do these things? What happened in their life that brought them to this? Anyway, we had our prayer, small groups. I got home and just got a royal email. "Pastor Dan, that was so wrong. That could not have been more wrong. There is a time to talk about forgiveness and all of that, okay, but it was not tonight. It was too soon. It just happened today. 3,000 people died today. Let us grieve. Let us be a little angry. Don't make us feel guilty for being a little angry at these people today. We can deal with forgiveness later, but not tonight. That was wrong." Okay. Oops. But Jesus says this little verse, and he says a few verses later, the Father, if you don't forgive others, the Father will not forgive you. What about that? Not easy, three little words. Love your enemies. I dated a girl years ago, long before Hilda. We got engaged, had a wedding date set, went away for a trip. On the trip, I got a note that it wasn't going to happen. Got a rumor that there was an old boyfriend, and anyway, stuff happened. Years later, I'm pastoring in La Sierra. I preach a sermon on love and forgiveness, and I'm standing at one of the doors, and people are coming by, and a man who I knew back then, and he said, "You know that I was the one who was involved with her. Slept with my girlfriend." And he says, "Can you forgive me?" He's standing in line with a group of people coming out. There's people backing up behind him. I just preached on love and forgiveness. And this guy wants me to forgive him for what he did to me years ago. What am I supposed to do? Three little words. Love your enemies. I collect some of these stories. They want to bring you pictures of them all, so I just tell you about them. When it's hard to love and forgive. You read these stories about South Africa in a courtroom, and they're trying to do what they call the truth and reconciliation. And people in the court stand up and they forgive the people who killed their kids or killed their wife. Adventist people stood up and forgave. The whole court sings Amazing Grace. It's hard. World War II, Japanese went over to Korea. People were in church on Sunday morning. They were singing a particular song, and they burned the whole church down. People in there. After the war, some Japanese church heard about it. They raised the money to build them a new church. They send the money over. They build a new church. The Japanese church comes over to dedicate the church with them. Here's half the Koreans over here, Japanese over here. No one talking. It's just too hard. Whole church service, and they're singing the same song that they were singing when it got burned down, and one person couldn't stand it anymore, walks across the aisle and shakes hands with the Japanese. And then it broke, and both groups melted, hugging each other. It's not easy. 3 little words: love your enemies. There was a Christian pastor, was one of the first ones to parachute into Japan when the war was over. The first Sunday, a week ago, we bombed 100,000 people killed, atomic bombs. And this pastor walks in, finds a little church on Sunday morning. It's the first American they have ever seen in that country, just bombed 100,000 of their people. No one talks to him, no one shakes hands. He sits there by himself. And then comes time for communion. No one serves him. Finally, one old Japanese man can't pass this by. And he goes and he serves the American. Love your enemies, what it says. I had a picture up a second ago, I don't know if you can still find that, of Elmina Castle. Elmina Castle is on the coast of Ghana. I was doing a week of prayer. They took me down to Elmina Castle. This is the castle where they brought the slaves out. They would go into the interior and bring these slaves all shackled. They would put them in Elmina Castle for a few days, weeks, or months. Terrible. And then they would put them to what's called a point of no return, put them on a ship. A third of them died on the way to America or to England or somewhere. The black man from Ghana is telling a story. He tells a story every day. He said 11 million or more came through here. And he begins to cry. He tells a story every day. It's 300 years ago. How do you forgive such things? One more. 4 young men up in San Francisco camping up in the mountains. They thought they put their fire out. They put dirt over it. They thought it was done. They came back down, but the fire blew up, destroyed thousands of acres, came down into the town and destroyed 4 families' homes. Everyone's angry at these 4 boys. How can you do that? Those families were going to sell their homes and move away. They just couldn't live with it. They had a big town meeting, and the mayor stood up and said, "We don't want you to go. We need you here. Stay here with us. It's okay." And the families who were burned out came up and hugged the boys and said, "It's okay. It's okay." And they forgave. Love your enemies. But these are the classic, these are the Hall of Fame stories. Most of us don't have those kinds of stories. It's how do you feel about the cop who's writing a ticket behind you with the lights going? It's about the referee who calls you out when it wasn't right, about the teacher who gave you a bad grade, about the boss who fired you, that it wasn't fair, people who say something about you that's not. It's how do you deal with those people day to day, day to day? And Jesus said, love your enemies. It's not easy. The Bible says we should pray, thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. You've all read the story, heard the story in South Carolina. Man walked into church and began to just spray bullets. And at the court, family members stood up and said, we forgive you. We forgive you. Their Christianity won out over their humanity, over their natural world. And they say, we will not live by this world's value. We will live by our values, the kingdom values. Jesus said, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And Pastor Tony talks about it week after week after week. We don't just believe in a kingdom someday, but we will slip away and escape to another world. The kingdom is now. Kingdom is here. Even if there was no second coming, even if there was no heaven, it would still be worth it to be a Christian, to live kingdom now. And we live differently. We think differently. We feel differently. Everything is turned upside down. What does it mean to say, love your enemies? C.S. Lewis says it doesn't say you have to like your enemies. It doesn't mean you have to put them on your Christmas list. It doesn't mean you have to make them your best friend. It doesn't mean you have to go camping with them or go to Europe with them. It doesn't mean any of that. But it does mean you have to forgive them. It does mean you have to treat them with respect. It does mean you have to wish them well. It does mean you have to hope that they will be in heaven with you. C.S. Lewis writes a chapter on this in Mere Christianity, and he says, it's really not so hard to figure out. Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. We all mess up. But we don't give up on ourselves. Just because we all have this inside of ourselves. We lose enough sleep, we get under enough stress. There's a dark side in all of us. But when we mess up, we forgive ourselves. We still love ourselves. We still give ourselves hope. We give ourselves one more chance. We said, okay, try harder, do better. But we don't give up on ourselves. Do the same for them. That's what it means to love your enemies. Do you have to do it in an instant? Or does God give you a little time to work this out? Love your enemies. Most of you probably have heard by now, my father was walking on a sidewalk and a truck came along and hit him. He flew through the air, fell to the ground, died 8 hours later. Hit and run. 14 years later, we still don't know who did it. The police thought they had an idea, but didn't think they had enough evidence, so they let him go. We hope maybe someday he'll be in a bar talking to a girl and he's drunk and he begins to tell stories, and out it comes. I would love to meet him. I would love to give him Bible studies. But my brothers and I, that day, in an instant, made a decision that we said, we are not going to have this man be in jail or rot in hell someday in order for us to be okay. We're going to be okay with this person right now. We would love for him to be in heaven. I would love to give him Bible studies. I would love for him to meet my Father in heaven. Somehow that day, I did it in an instant. Love your enemies. But when that girl who cheated on me years ago went to counseling and wrote a letter to me, told me some things, and down at the bottom says, please forgive me. I got out a sheet of paper ready to write a note back to say wonderful forgiveness, and I couldn't write it. I just couldn't write it. And evidently I had more work to do before I could write that. So sometimes it's slow. It's a wonderful book that Pastor Tony and I have been reading, and another speaker, Randy Roberts. Sarah and I heard him speak up in Seattle, Randy Roberts. William Webb, and he says, God takes us in stages. He doesn't take us faster than we can handle. He says it's like a rubber band. He takes the rubber band and he stretches it as far as he can before it snaps. And so he takes us where we are a little bit. Randy Roberts says it's like the football game 100 years ago. They played football without the forward pass. You just gave the ball and he ran. There was always just a pile. 3 yards and a cloud of dust on a big pile. And he said God took people with paganism. Paganism says, if you mess with me, I can go and destroy your whole village to get justice. But God says, not you, not my people. I say to you, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. He cannot do that, only proportional. He takes them a little ways, step by step, 3 yards and a cloud of dust. But then I'll never forget it. Remember, Sarah, Randy was preaching in Seattle that just won the Super Bowl. He said, 3 yards and a cloud of dust, all through the Old Testament. God just moves people bit by bit. He takes time. But 10, all of a sudden, there's a quarterback who says, I'm not going to go this way anymore. And he fades back and he throws a Hail Mary 40 yards down the field. And God sends Jesus down to our world. And God himself is here. And now God goes around here talking about forgiveness and love and mercy and turning the other cheek and going the second mile. And then he gets up on a cross. And he says, we're not going to do violence anymore. He puts the guy's ear back. And he dies on a cross. And he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And God takes people over time. And God gives us a little time to learn how to love your enemies. And he's patient with us. How can we learn to love our enemies? I want to give credit a little bit. I read a sermon by Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was in the Birmingham jail for some of the social action stuff that they were doing. And he wrote several sermons while he was in there. This is one of the sermons that he wrote. And then after that, he preached it every year in his church. Love your enemies. And he broke it down to this. He said there's some steps on how we can learn to love our enemies. First, he says we have to look at ourselves. See, Jesus said, you look at a mote in someone else's eye. When you have a beam in your own eyes, he said, first, you have to look in yourself to see, who am I? None of us are perfect. We all have flaws. Maybe we don't go out and blow up trucks. Maybe we don't go drive into crowds of people. Maybe we don't go into schools. But we all hold grudges. We all talk about people. We all hurt people. We all do things that wish we hadn't done that. He said, look at yourselves. I don't know if I've told you all about the old lady in my church, lived down the street from us, Riverside. I did her funeral. I told this story. She told me she was angry at the neighbor. This lady is a saint of God, 85 years old. She is wonderful, perfect. But she was angry at the neighbor whose tree was coming over into her property. So she went and got some poison, and every night she would go out in the middle of the late at night, and she would just stand by the tree and then stick a little syringe of that poison into the tree. Every night, stuck a little more poison in the tree. And gradually there was enough poison in that tree, and that tree died, and they had to come and take it away. This lady was 99% perfect. You would never think of anything. But she had 1%. She's putting poison into her neighbor's tree. She's not perfect. You heard about the famous pastor this week who had to be let go from his church. Wonderful pastor, but he's drinking. We all have something. We're in Thailand. We're at a couple days at the beach before we came back. The wonderful pool. So I go down to swim a few laps in the pool. While I'm in the pool, another young pastor was there, 32, 33, wonderful. Taught him in college and seminary, taking him around the world. He's young and buff, and he's swimming laps. So I'm going to keep up with this kid. So I'm swimming laps. After about 10 minutes, I can't do it anymore. I need to rest a little bit. But I think, I don't want him to see me resting. And so I would only rest when he was swimming away from me, where he couldn't see me. And then as soon as he began to turn around, I would go in again. Then he would go, I would rest a little bit. But finally, I just couldn't keep up. He swam for another half an hour after me. I'm 63, he's 33. I couldn't keep up. Jealous. We're all sick people. Messed up. And Martin Luther King says we need to look at ourselves. Number 2, he says you need to find some good in them. Nobody is a perfect 10. Nobody is a complete 0. We look at these people who do evil as monsters, but said they're human beings. They were born. They have a mother. They have a father. They're people. They grew up, hopefully, sort of normal. They went to school, they had normal life, and then all of a sudden something happened in their background. They're human. See some good in them. Try to understand what their situation was, what led these people to do these kinds of things. There is no excuse. Please understand, there is no excuse. There is no excuse for anybody to grab a truck and drive into a crowd of people. There is no excuse to grab a gun and shoot up a group of kids in a school. There's no excuse. But he said, try to understand. You go over to Israel, Palestine. What would it feel like to go to your daughter's wedding and all of a sudden a rocket goes off? What would it feel like to be in Palestine? Someone took your house. Someone built houses when you think is your land. And you live in a refugee camp all your life, and there's no schools, or there's no hospital, there's no jobs. There's checkpoints everywhere you go. Understand people's situation. No excuses. But he says, look and understand these people. And understand they're human beings. Number 3. When you have a chance to defeat somebody, don't do it. It's an amazing thing he says here. Somebody's hurting you. Maybe they've saying something about you, or they did something that was not fair to you. Whatever it is, they're your enemy. They're difficult to work with at work. And all of us, then you have them. You've got something on them, and you have a chance to defeat them. And you have a chance you've got the goods on them. He said, doesn't mean that people don't have to be punished if they do something terrible. Absolutely. But on a personal level, if you have a chance to defeat them, he says, don't do it. Let them off. He says, like the story of David. David had Saul in his hands in a cave. He was supposed to be king. God anointed him, and here's Saul in his hands, and he said, this is your moment. God gave him to you. And David won't do it. He cuts off a little piece of cloth. He doesn't do it. Pastor came to our church from England one time, and he told a story. He said it was Christmas Day. He's at his mother and father's home, England. And he's in the living room with his little nephew, and he's teaching the little nephew how to play rugby. So they're down on this brand new, beautiful white carpet. And they're down there, and they're banging into each other to show them how to play rugby, when all of a sudden a pot tips over because of what they're doing, and black dirt goes all over the brand new white carpet. What's Grandma going to say? And that moment, Grandma comes in ready to take them to lunch, and she sees the black dirt all over the white carpet. And she grabs up the little boy and says, it's time for Christmas dinner, and takes him in. When we got off the plane, we were at the Orangewood parking lot last week. And one of our older ladies was the last one waiting there. I'm waiting for her, and she's waiting for her sister to come. She's always late. Every time I call her, she's always late. She's never on time. And here came the sister, and I said, don't say anything to her about it. Just let her get away with it today. Oh, Pastor Dan, that's hard. It's hard. Number 4, meditate on your best picture of God. You will treat people the way you see God. There's a famous picture. I don't know if you can show that, Alan. Can you show that again, of this foot washing? This picture was made by a group of young people, doctors in Loma Linda, who were doing a Picture of God tour called Good News Tour. And they had this painting painted back when Osama bin Laden was ruling the world with 9/11 and all the other things. And they have a picture of Jesus washing the feet. Very controversial. What is your picture of God? If your picture of God is that God sometimes turns on you, God is up in heaven judging, God sometimes withdraws his love if you do things that cross him and break his rules, then that's how you treat people. But if your picture of God is always good, God is only loving, God is only forgiving, that's all he ever is, then that will gradually become your picture of God and how you treat people. Matthew 5 says, God says the sun and rain on the just and the unjust. It's just who God is. And the more you meditate on God, his picture becomes who you are and how you treat people. This is famous. Martin Luther King talks about it. C.S. Lewis, many writers, in the 3 different words for love. The first word is eros, which is sort of romantic love. You love people because they turn you on, they make you excited, and you love them because of something about them. Philia or philos is friendship love. You love people because there's something you like about them. You do something good for each other. You do same kinds of things, friendship love. But they say agape love is different. Now this love has nothing to do with what the other person is like or anything else. You don't like someone because they're likable. You love them because God loves them. You love them as a principle, and you use love to love and redeem and change the world. You love them because Jesus died for them. It's different. And we learn to love like God. And then finally, why should we stop violence and love our enemies? Number one, he says we should do that to stop the cycle. He said, somewhere this cycle is going to have to stop. If every time someone does something bad to you, so then you hate or you hold grudge or you pay back, and then they have to pay back more, and gradually then the universe gets filled with violence. He said, somewhere somebody has to say stop, and stop the cycle and stop the chain of hate. He says he and his brother were driving somewhere there in the south. Brother was driving in the car late at night. And nobody was dimming their lights. They were just shining their bright lights. And finally the brother gets mad and he says, I'm going to shine my brights at them. And Martin Luther King says, don't do that. Don't do that. He said, if that's what we do, if you dim your brights, then they have to bright theirs, and no one ever dims. Somebody has to dim their lights and say, let's stop. Somebody in Israel and Palestine has to say, enough already. We're going to stop. Enough. I'm going to put my gun down and put my sword down. And so a Supreme Court justice this week says something terrible about Donald Trump. So Donald Trump has to tweet out something terrible about her. And pretty soon, a cycle goes. And somebody says, okay, sorry, stop. And stop the cycle. And say, enough already. And number two, he suggests that we need to love our enemies in order to set ourselves free. There is something that is just corrosive in your soul. If you continue to hate, someone hurts you and you hate, they may not even know that you have this feeling about them, but it eats away at your own soul. I don't know if you read about the letter this young man wrote, open letter after the Paris attacks last year. And his wife, this beautiful makeup artist, was killed. He's got a 1-year-old little boy. And the next day he writes an open letter in the newspaper, Antoine, and he says, to the terrorists, I want you to know we are not going to let you change who we are. I am not going to let you change who my little boy is. We will not let you take our happiness away. We will not let you put anger and hate inside of us or in my little 1-year-old son. We are going to live free. If you hold grudges and you have hate, it just eats away as corrosive acid in your own life and eats away. And so he says, don't do this. Don't love your enemies for their sake. Don't do it for them. Do it for you. Set yourself free and say, I will not carry this. Don't give them any space inside your head to say, I will not. I will not go over and over again what people have done to me in the past. I'm just not going to carry it. I'm going to set myself free. Love your enemies. 3 little words. Love your enemies. Well, it's an old story Tony Campolo has told 1,000 times. He said he went down to a church down in the south. 500 people are there worshiping, black and white and all the colors. And he has the pastor, just a good old boy from the south, and he said, hey, how did you get this happen? Is it the Supreme Court decision from 18, whatever? Is that why you did it? This guy said, we have nothing to do with Supreme Court decisions. He said, well, tell me how it happened. He said, I was in the church. The pastor died. We only had like 25 people coming. The elders couldn't find anyone to be the pastor. I said, I'll be the pastor. So they let me preach a sermon. So I preached about loving your neighbor and stuff. People got mad. You don't preach about that here in the South. Don't you preach like that anymore? He said, once I knew that it made them mad, I preached it every week. I preached the same sermon 4 weeks in a row. He said, what happened? They wanted to fire me, but I wouldn't let them fire me. I fired them. He said, I preached that church down to 4 people. He said, but from then on, we only let people in who had been touched by the gospel of Jesus and were willing to love people that they were raised not to love. And gradually, this has become our church. And that's what it means to live by the new kingdom. I won't live by those values anymore. The values all around me, my natural values that I grew up with. I will now live by the values of a new kingdom. The kingdom of God. And so we pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And we live by these 3 little words. Love your enemies. God bless you.